Okay, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this session about corporate governance and geopolitics. I'm Marcel Rindisbacher. I'm the director of the Ravi K. Mehrotra Institute, and we have the pleasure here to really have excellent specialists to talk about, I think, a topic that is very timely. We are living in very interesting times. We're facing a maybe new kind of multipolar world where suddenly corporate governance questions become really interesting. So fiduciary duty, corporate diplomacy, strategic neutrality, they are really now essential to be talking about in the corporate boardrooms. And so we're really looking forward to a great conversation. Also, after the presentation is over at the table, please sit here, you get dessert, and you can still continue to the conversation. But with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So to my left is Ruth Aguilera. She's the Brodsky Trustee Professor in Corporate Governance at Northeastern University. Then Roy Shapira, he is a professor of law at Reichman University, a member of the European Corporate Governance Institute, and also a visiting fellow at Mehrotra this semester here. Then Kevin McGovern, he is the president of the New England chapter of the National Academy of Corporate Directors, and our moderator, Curt Nickisch. So looking forward to a great conversation. Take it from here. Thank you.
Thank Marcel. Thanks to such a great panel for being here, and it's really great to speak to such a great audience. We've got a really fun topic for this live recording of Is Business Broken? We're going to tackle one of the more complex and maybe more urgent challenges facing boardrooms today, and that's the intersection of geopolitics and corporate governments. You know, for decades, the standard corporate playbook was global integration, efficiency, and now that's being rewritten by trade wars, sanctions, supply chain weaponization, the rising tide of economic nationalism. And the question is no longer sort of if geopolitics affects business, but how boards govern in an era of constant global volatility and, I think it's fair to say, diverging international standards. So we have three exceptional people to unpack this. And first, I just want to say thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Ruth, Roy, Kevin, great to have you. Let's dive right in. And Ruth, I'm going to start with you as an international business professor. Can you start just by painting the landscape for us? Like, what are the macro level shifts that are now kind of fundamentally changing how global companies and their boards have to operate?
Thank you, and thank you for having us here. So I think to answer the question, we need to think about what is geopolitics. And so geopolitics is how geography affects politics, and then politics is basically the distribution of power. And we're thinking about how that affects businesses. So what are the main kind of international business areas that they are affected by geopolitics? And I would think of the following. Definitely like global trade and tariffs, sanctions, quotas, all these, everything. Global trade is not just tariffs, but everything else. The second one is the mobility of human talent around the world. Mm-hmm. And then a third one that comes to mind is about the global value chain, how the access of resources, it is recalibrated, rebalanced around the world in the global value chain. So I would say these three to start.
Yeah, and just to underline this a little bit, I mean, those have always been something that you have to worry about if you're a director of a multinational company. What's changing? What's different?
So what's changing is that there is a rebalancing on these alliances around the world. And so part of it is due to wars, like real words. Other part of it is due to the new. So rebalancing the globe. I would say rebalancing the global the global power on across countries. And I'll take
Yeah, gotcha, Kevin.
Well,
I see you.
I was going to add.
Yeah.
I agree with everything Ruth said. Also, I'd add one more, which is the availability of markets, right? Mm-hmm. Entering or exiting markets and the ease with which companies can do that. But I think what puts us really in the center of the conversation for boards today is the fact that all of these are happening right now at once. And I don't think that's happened in a very long time for most companies, that you have all of these issues: availability of talent, availability of markets, availability of supply, all changing within a very short period of time. And so I think all boards that I work with are very focused on each of these matters, but they also have to be focused on all of them at once, which puts a lot of burden on companies and their boards.
Yeah. Roy, I want to bring you into the conversation too here. From a legal perspective, if you're a director of a multinational company, what's keeping you up at night?
Too many things.
Yeah.
I'm glad I'm not a director.
Yeah.
So the board of directors is the organ in charge of risk oversight in a company, right? And so when bad things happen, when risks materialize, the regulators and the investors will usually ask, where was the board? And from a legal perspective, to go to your question, you could be actually held personally liable for harms that the company suffered from risks being materialized. So take the Boeing 737 MAX debacle. Okay, so 2 airplanes crash, and there's a human tragedy on a mass scale. More than 300 people are dead. There's also huge attendant financial, legal, reputational harms to the company. For Boeing, the most conservative estimates is $20 billion. So at that point, the shareholders and regulators will try to hold the boards accountable. How did it happen under your not so watchful eye? So in legal terms, we call it the oversight duties. So boards have to be proactive about compliance. They cannot just sit there and wait until someone flags a problem to them. They have to make sure that there's a system that collects information about those potential risks, and that the system escalates the red flags to them, and that they respond to the red flags. Now, if you translate it to what Ruth and Kevin just said about the geopolitical risks, I think it's kind of straightforward in the sense that for certain global companies, geopolitical tensions, geopolitical risk these days become critical. It could affect your core entire business model. Okay, you look at supply chain disruptions, you look at trade wars, you look at visa restrictions and how you hire and how you retain talent. So if something bad like that happens and the company suffers negative, adverse economic consequences, and again, the regulators and investors will go into the board and they will say, did you anticipate it? Did you discuss it in real time? We don't expect you to guarantee outcomes. We don't expect you to completely eradicate all those problems, but at least show us that you didn't ignore this.
We've heard from all three now, and I just want to mention at this point that we're going to bring everybody into the conversation. You all have the option to ask questions. I'm going to get to as many as possible. We're going to probably get to those at the end, but if you haven't looked at this behind us, please do just ask questions as they come up, and then we'll get to as many as we can in the course of this conversation. So, Kevin, we just heard from Roy how you almost have to have like the war room set up before something happens, and he gave this example of Boeing that was kind of a nightmare scenario for a company. At Deloitte, you used to advise company boards, and now you represent directors at NACD. When a crisis hits, like what's on that first 72 hours checklist?
Usually a lot of angst and a lot of crazy kind of energy. We tell boards all the time.
That doesn't sound good.
No, it's not a good situation. Quite frankly, many boards are caught a little bit flat-footed because they haven't practiced the crisis management, the time when the crisis happens, who's in charge, who makes decisions, who calls whom. What I've seen most often is the board making decisions, is management making decisions. And I would say that in certain situations, it ought to be more management driven. In other situations, perhaps more board driven. But having that conversation in advance is a really important aspect of good governance and understanding what could happen to you. I think the most relevant one today is a cyber attack involving ransomware. Right, but we're talking about geopolitics today. So what happens if we're in a country and our supply chains get shut down? What happens if we are about to launch something in a country and we can no longer do that because of market changes? You have to practice and think about those things. Who's in charge and who gets to make which decisions, which I think most companies do to some degree, but probably not to be fully prepared.
Yeah, please.
So I do teach a class on, it's called moments of truth, right? Like those are the moments that you haven't planned in your risk map, right? Like you haven't planned in your risk map that there's going to be a tornado or there's going to be a flood or a fire, because these are things that you plan in your crisis map, and then you decide, as it was said here, that Kevin said that who is going to take the lead, who do we need to contact, etc. But the true, those true moments of crisis, like the black swans that you haven't planned, or it's called now the gray rhinos, which are things that they are, that they might happen to you, like a regulatory or environmental. You know that they might happen, but you think, well, or like a cyber crime, like you are absolutely not protected, but it's like, well, they're not going to get after us. So to answer your question, I think this is a lot related to geopolitics, like a new government, a coup d'etat, these things that you really don't expect. They're expropriating you. When I teach, I think my number one takeaway when I teach boards about this is you need to have a consistent message. You need to be very much aligned about what the company is about. So what is the purpose of this company, and then have a consistent message. And then another key part is have very, very clear who your stakeholders are, right? Who is your first line, your primary stakeholders that you need to address, and then do that kind of assessment very quickly, and then have a very consistent message across the parties and very true to who you are as a company.
It's striking me that if you don't have a good board dynamic, this is one of those moments where it gets exposed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I remember it doesn't seem like a geopolitical issue, but when the pandemic hit, it very quickly became a geopolitical issue because the way that different countries reacted, with whether they sent everybody home, whether they could send everyone home, whether they decided it was actually better to bring people back to work, what was open, what was closed, created a very diverse map of risks for many of my global clients at the time. And this is really when the culture of the board and the board's relationship with management matters, because you've got all these differing, potentially differing answers to the same question. Right? Do we send our employees to work in a country where it's open and the expectation is? Do we keep them home, even though some people may say they're safe for work? It's a very interesting dynamic when the moment of crisis hits.
Yeah.
Curt, I think that your intuition about board dynamics being stressed is exactly the point. I think that in 2025, the biggest problem is board bandwidth, because we ask boards so much. We ask them to deal with those geopolitical tensions, and we ask them to deal with cybersecurity and the climate, and oh, by the way, also the normal things of financial reporting and succession planning and hire the CEO and executive pay. And even if the directors are really, really great and they're independent and they're expert and they have all the information, you need like the perfect dynamics, the perfect processes, the perfect pre-meeting materials. You need everything to be perfect, just in order for you to fit all those huge issues into one agenda.
Mm-hmm. Well, you brought us to the core of this conversation, which is governance. And maybe we should step back for a second, Kevin. Like at the highest level, what is the board's duty here? Is managing geopolitical risk like an extension of their fiduciary duty? And what realistic influence do they have in a foreign policy sphere?
Yeah, I think to answer that question, Curt, we have to go back to what is the baseline responsibility of the board, and it's not to manage the company. So in part, my answer to the question is no, they should not be in the business of managing geopolitical risk. What they should be in the business of is asking management, are you ready for this event to happen, that event to happen? Have you thought about this? Where's the playbook for that? There's a saying, and Roy said it this morning at our earlier thing, noses in, fingers out. That's often the board credo. What that means is stick your nose in and ask the right questions, but you can't have your keys on the keyboard. That's management's job. But you have to continually ask those questions. And sometimes they're uncomfortable because you know the answer may not be great, but you've got to do that. That is the board's job as a fiduciary of the organization. You've got to make sure the company is as prepared as it can be for whatever possibility it may face.
And what about externally? Like, it's a funny question to ask, but do boards need to have a foreign policy?
In terms of foreign expertise on the board, or?
Well, you're working in different places. You have these stakeholders, and their demands to manage in different places, and and things can change. You have to be ready for that as well. Like, how do you get ready for, I guess, the more political part of the geopolitical problem?
Right. So I think just like with geopolitics, as Ruth defined it, also today, those political tensions become a critical corporate governance aspect of how you manage the company. And firms' corporate political engagement goes way beyond traditional lobbying. We're seeing firms and CEO taking political stances on issues that don't have much to do with their core business, like gender disparity or climate change or what have you. And these comes as geopolitics. These comes with big legal, reputational, financial risks. You can think, in the US, it's very timely these days. You can think of examples like the most classic example of straightforward is consumer backlash or investor backlash, like with the Bud Light advertisement. Or more timely examples are political retaliations. Even if consumers don't revolt, then politicians could revolt. You could have regulatory retaliation or certain enforcement actions and so on and so forth. So that's definitely part of the dilemmas that boards are facing. And some of them are reaching the conclusion, and Kevin, maybe otherwise, but some of them are reaching the conclusion that maybe the best solution is neutrality, or to be more precise, just stick to what you are as a company. Stick to what you are in terms of what is your core business model, what are your values, and try to stay grounded in that, and this will help you kind of navigate these stormy, weather of damn if you do, damn if you don't kind of dynamics.
Yeah, if your employees go along with that.
Yeah.
Ruth.
Yeah, so I think also in terms of the geopolitics, companies, it's kind of going back to, the apartheid times in South Africa when GM decided to boycott and pull out. So companies all over the world are also asked, why are you during the Russia-Ukraine war, why are you not pulling out of Russia, or why are you staying in Russia? So either, you are dumb either way, whether you do something or you don't do something. But what you definitely need to do as a corporation is, and from the board, is to have a clear message again on, what are you doing and why you're doing it. Whether you stay, you leave, but this is like a geopolitical decision. And the same like sourcing, like in Europe, companies are not allowed to source energy from Russia, but then they go through Turkey, so you have to be very true to your message. And obviously there are also sectors such as semiconductors, defense, energy, AI, which are more critical as well, right? Like there are geopolitics, and then these sectors that they are so strategic, almost to the national security level, to countries, that then there is like domestic politics and international politics mixed up. But companies are legal entities, and they have to have a voice, and they do have a voice, sometimes influencing policy even. So corporate relations, what about the board? So corporate relations has become a very important skill for boards to not necessarily to have, and I know this morning you were talking about specialized directors, not necessarily to have a corporate affairs person in the board, but definitely to inform the board and to keep the board educated.
Yeah, just to jump off of that, Roy, you've done research on specialist directors, and some boards are actually hiring like an international relations sort of specialist on the boards. But your research was also a little bit skeptical of having like, subject matter experts for different things on a board. Can you just develop that a little bit further for us?
Sure. So I think it's illustrated by what you said just 5 minutes ago, meaning, so it's not just geopolitics, it's also politics, it's also cyber, it's also climate. And so do you really bring on the board like someone with a narrow subject matter expertise on each one of these topics? It's not necessarily conducive to the discussions of the board overall. It may not even be conducive to the discussion of the board on the specific topic that you bring the expert on. Mm-hmm. Because then you have this like a authority bias where the other directors are saying, I don't need to invest in learning in geopolitics or AI. I can just defer to Ruth, who is the AI expert, and to Kevin, who is the geopolitical expert. So I guess the idea here is you could outsource the expertise, meaning you can bring someone from the outside. You can train your entire boardrooms, just so they don't have to be expert, they have to be proficient just to ask the questions. Because just like Kevin said before, their job is not to do the micromanagement. Their job is to do the big picture oversight. So they need to have some expertise or know-how in order to ask the right question, not just ask what's in the PowerPoint deck in front of them, but to anticipate future problem and to process the answers. But from my research, what I came out with it is that it shouldn't be with narrow subject matter expertise. It's better to do through training, through education, and to bring in experts on specific topics. Because as much as geopolitical tensions are important, you have many other topics on the agenda. So you want to bring them on separately.
Got it. Let's stick with the geopolitics for a second, because you can, I don't know how many companies do business both in North America and in Europe, right? And you may have a situation where neutrality isn't even an option. You can have Europe saying you got to pay more attention to ESG issues, DEI, and you take it to the extreme in a Trumpian world. You shouldn't be spending any time on that. We're going to punish you for that. So how do you manage kind of these different expectations from the legal frameworks for even just what a board should be focusing on?
So sometimes they take this decision out of the board's hand. If you're talking about Europe and ESG, or how you treat the environment, or how you treat human rights, the European Union just passed a year ago a couple of very strong ESG legislation acts that demands that large companies, regardless if they're European or not, even if they're Americans and they generate significant revenues in Europe, they still need to, to comply with these regulations, meaning they need to monitor and prevent and remediate a host of numerous like ESG issues, going from marine pollution to biodiversity to collective bargaining to child labor. And they need to monitor and prevent and remediate all those issues, not just in their own operations, but also in the operations of their supply chain partners. Mm-hmm. So to the extent, and there's a huge debate over whether this should apply on both sides of the Atlantic right now, but to the extent that it applies, it makes everything that we discussed up until this point, puts it on steroid, because now you as a board, do you bring in expertise? How do you fit this into the agenda? You have to make sure that the entire supply chain, they almost like enlist large public companies as regulators of the entire world.
I would like to add to that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
I want to go back to something that Roy said a few minutes ago in answer to your question. You can't respond to all of these things individually. It's impossible. I think what companies have to do, and the board is responsible for, is keeping the management team on track as to who are we? What is our vision? What is our strategy? As an organization, what is our ethos? What are our morals and values? And if you stick to that, you can defend, if that's the right word, a lot of the things that you choose to do. One of my clients had a 100-issue dashboard that they maintained around issues that they thought could come into them. And they had positions on every one, not public ones. But they knew that if something had to be said about something, they were ready, and of course they were always refreshing these positions. They were ready to say something based on who they were, what their role was in that part of the world, let's say. They may have a major role versus a minor role, and just be ready. Another one of my clients created a framework that said, let's take all these issues, and then let's look at who we are, and if it fulfills these factors, then we're going to be ready to say something. But if it doesn't fulfill all these factors, we're not. We're going to stay silent. And I know for that organization, that was somewhat controversial, because there were people who wanted them to say things on very significant issues, right? Whether it be on gender diversity or what have you. But this company was saying, no, we only have a limited number of topics that we can have a position on, effectively. And so we have to have a framework in order to decide what those are and take the bias out of the conversation to some degree.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that set of questions too, sort of like, is this the sort of thing we weigh in on? Roy, let's assume a board does speak out on something that they're pressured to or feel pressure to issue a statement on. What are the legal and regulatory tripwires there?
It's mostly not legal. It's mostly not legal tripwires. Okay. They enjoy a wide discretion to go and rationalize it and say that we thought that it's best for the long-term value of the company, for our reputation, for what our workers care about, for what our consumers care about, for what some investors care about. So it's not like they will be held personally liable for something like that. It's mostly the reputational aspect. Okay. You can draw attention. You could be seen as doing something just like, Kevin's colleague did, not in congruence with what your company stands for. Here you are giving us those noble statements about climate change, and then we're seeing you donating or funding those climate denial think tanks. So it will be mostly about reputational risk, Curt, I think.
Okay.
In this way.
And I mean, I was imagining scenarios where if you say something about a country's human rights record, you might run afoul of like a defamation law in that country. Is there not a big deal?
I don't imagine
doesn't
it
come
would
up
be
a lot.
a big deal in terms of what you say, but this does connect us to our the beginning of our conversation and things that Ruth said. For example, think of if you operate in India. India has, if I recall correctly, the Industrial Disputes Act, meaning that if you do some mass layovers, you have to ask the government for permission, and you have to submit the request like 90 days ahead of time. Uh-huh. So this is kind of an example of something that sounds like a routine layoff in your country, maybe a very complicated legal risk, maybe reputational risk when you operate globally, which means that you need to factor this, what keeps you up at night. You need to factor all these things.
Yeah. Ruth, what's the bigger risk from a strategic mindset speaking out or saying nothing at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think, no, so, from my point of view, the main responsibility of the board is to assess the risk and see, and also decide what is the risk tolerance of the board. Like, how much risk are we going to take? How much insurance do we have towards taking those risks, right? Because insurance now is a huge part for insurance of your global value chain, insurance of your directors and officers' insurance. So if the role of the board is to assess the risk appetite, to assess like how much risk, all these decisions are, to me, related to risk, right? Like, are you going to violate human rights? Okay, what is the risk that goes with that? And then see the opportunities as well relative to the risk. So I think I see the role of the board deciding, the main role of the board for me is deciding what the company is about, like what is the mission, whether you want to call it mission, purpose, and then tie that to how are you going to accomplish that? That's the strategy. And within a strategy, like a huge part of a strategy is what are we going to do and how we get there. A huge part of a strategy is the risk that, how much risk are you going to assume to take that? And the risk and opportunities, they are the two parts of the coin. So really, to get to your question, really speaking up or not depends on, is this issue relevant to what this company is trying to accomplish? Is this issue relevant to the strategy? And then that's how I would approach it. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's.
And are those risk assessment systems in place strong enough to figure out, South Africa was an example, right? Yeah. So if you're going to divest from a market, it's a little easier to quantify what that's going to do to your business. The reputational brand equity stuff,
I think you need to be consistent, like what Roy was saying. You need to be consistent in your message. It's not only like you need to have like a strategy for communications. That's why most companies now, they have a chief communications officer, and there is so many resources devoted to communication because it's social media, it is so many other things, digital platforms. So that's another area of geopolitical risk, right? Like the misinformation, disinformation. So I think having somebody that manages what is the message, once you speak up, that packages that message, and the board needs to approve that as well, in many cases, yeah.
So to piggyback on what Ruth just said, I think the reputational risk is much trickier than all the other risks. Yeah. First of all, it's not insurable. It's not like a directors and officers insurance for legal risk or classic insurance types for physical risk. The reputational fallout is not insurable. And when we speak about geopolitics, it's also not predictable. It's based on emotion, and it's fast moving, and it happens elsewhere in the world where you don't really understand the expectations of other consumers or investors or regulators. So that's really an uncharted territory. I mean, and this is why, again, echoing Kevin and Ruth, you can't think that you really would know how to manage the reputational fallout, let alone in your own country, let alone in other countries around the world. So the best way for you to manage it is just to stay grounded to who you are as a company, how you present yourself as a company, to the facts. Don't try to take stands that are beyond that. And that's your best bet.
Yeah. I'd love to get just from each of you, like a quick case study of maybe a company that you worked with, something that you've paid attention to, but just whether it's a successful pivot or a major failure. Can you just tell the story of something that you think is emblematic here or has some lessons to draw from?
I'll start and I'll go back to a pandemic related issue. One of my clients was a large global financial institution, and they had an office in Wuhan, China. And they actually started to see the impact of the pandemic as it affected people and operations much earlier than perhaps others did. But it also became a political issue around, well, how much do we talk about this operation, and how much do we let other people know about it, and what have you. And their corporate values were around, we're all one company. We're a global organization. We have people all over the world. We have offices all over the world. So we're going to treat what's happening with those set of people just as carefully and as tently and as caringly as we are any of our American employees, any of our European employees. And I think it was a good lesson in how to really follow your corporate values, as Ruth said, right? We're a global organization. We value being a global organization, and treating all the employees the same set of care, same set of medical care. And but I think it was a little bit of a check for that organization to actually, be as clear and as outspoken as they were about how they wanted to handle that situation.
Yeah, I like that, having the values, knowing your values ahead of time.
I'm going to use the example that Ruth brought up earlier, the Russia-Ukraine war, and companies faced a dilemma, right? Some companies made a decisive exit, others didn't, right? And those that didn't had good reasons not to, because you're facing, in a market like Russia, you're facing major asset write-offs. You're going to do forced sales of your assets. You're going to suffer exit taxes. But then now studies are coming out showing the difference between the short-term hit of the asset write-offs and maybe the long-term gains for your public reputation if you're doing a decisive exit. And of course, it depends on the timing of the exit and the industry, semiconductor, energies, and things like that you mentioned. But I think it's a perfect illustration because the studies show that on average, the gains, long-term gains to your public reputation and the stock market reactions outweigh the short-term hit, the immediate hit that you suffer due to those asset write-offs. So that's, again, another real-world illustration of the dynamics where in 2025, you're on the board, you're the CEO, you're in the C-suite, you sometimes need to make decisions of the connections between geopolitical tensions and reputational risks. If you're reading the room, sometimes you need to take a hit in the short term in order to preserve value in the long run.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, there are so many examples. I'm just thinking about new ones. So let's see, one mini example. Like, you don't need to leave your country to have a geopolitical. Like, you could be in the same country. So, like, for instance, I'm from Barcelona, Spain, and in 2017, we had a huge referendum about the independence of Catalonia, and many companies left Catalonia and moved to Valencia and Madrid. So there are studies looking at, there was a political shift, like we have had in the United States every 4 years, this political shift. So sometimes companies should not just rush to decisions because there are political shifts, right? Like geopolitical, very harsh shifts, like leaving a region within a country. So another example that is legal, and Roy can correct me, is so there is this thing called Delaware exit. So I also think that's like a geopolitical thing in the United States. So there are some companies, not many, but there are some companies like, a well-known one, has they moved, is Tesla? Well-known one is Tesla, who has incorporated now in Texas, but they either go to Texas or Las Vegas. And the reason why they go to these states to incorporate is because they want less insight from the minority shareholders and the shareholders in general, and more, say, not even from the managers, but from the majority owners. So I would say that that's also geopolitics in trying to do arbitrage on in what jurisprudence, in what economic environment you situate yourself to take advantage of some of the circumstances in there. And so I think this movement is an interesting one. And my last three little example, now global, is I think some of these, and to end in a happy note, I think some of the US-China current tension has also allowed for other countries that were more in the periphery to really blossom, like Indonesia, Vietnam, because now all the companies in the US are doing China plus one, so they cannot only rely on the global value chain from China, so they pick other countries, right? Or even more proximate countries. So I think that diversifies their global value chain, makes it more resilient, and it might help other emerging markets to get on the global value chain.
You mentioned China. I'm just curious, what influence does China have on corporate governance? Just because I think we have a good sense of like how tariffs have affected it, and sort of the U.S. politics, European politics we've mentioned, but China is a major economic factor for multinationals. What influence does it have on these conversations?
I mean, I think it has a huge influence because, China imports so much here. There is so much trade, so we source so much from China. The role of semiconductors, especially like if we include Taiwan, TSMC in there, and how like the U.S. now has tried to sideline China by building like a huge supercomputer in Arizona, so we cannot depend on China in Phoenix. So I think China should be in every board agenda. Every board agenda is like, okay, how is China affecting us in this quarter?
So it connects to everything that we discussed about regulation and corporate governance. So just to give you an example of the EU ESG legislation that we talked about, now they face backlash from the US. US are saying, we're not going to do business with you. We'll use trade tools if you enforce those, crazy, ambitious climate, human rights, supply chain liability requirements on US companies. So now all of a sudden what China is doing, and if China is much easier because a lot of the companies have some state influence, so now what China is doing, so they're saying, we're going to adapt voluntarily. We're going to be the green companies. We're going to be the human rights companies. Why? Because now we will take the US place with working with the EU companies. So we can completely change our corporate governance, our values, the way that we do business, just to grab a better seat at the table in the trade wars. And now we're going to be the one partnering with Europe instead of you.
But, and China has great innovations in a shoestring. There are incredible entrepreneurs. TikTok hires so many companies that they do reverse innovation. The innovations come from there and come to the developed world.
Well, I was just going to say,
please.
You hear some people say, because you mentioned TikTok, Ruth, right? That for the U.S., TikTok was a big deal to get Chinese ownership, or at least majority ownership, out of the equation for TikTok, and for the Chinese, that was a giveaway. Right? What they really wanted was the reopening of the markets into the U.S. They wanted the reduction in tariffs. They wanted other things. So what we thought was a really big issue, at least many Americans would say, we got to keep TikTok running. I do not have a TikTok account. I don't actually care if TikTok keeps running, just for that. But many would say this is a very important aspect of our society, et cetera. For another country, that was seemingly not nearly as important. And so you got to understand, who cares about what, and in negotiations, what are you giving away versus what are you possibly getting? And to Roy's point about China becoming maybe the leader in climate and climate tech around the world, who would have thought that 12 months ago?
And then I think the other one that we cannot forget about China is the rare minerals, and how the rare minerals that they have and how important they are for U.S. semiconductors.
Yeah. This has been fantastic, and we have a whole bunch of awesome questions from the audience pouring in, so I'm going to get to those. Before we do, at this point in the conversation, is there any big misconception about corporate governance that we haven't talked about yet that you feel like we need to clear up? We got it all. Yeah.
No, I mean, I'll say one. I think there are big swings, big swings, so 5 years ago, it was sustainability. Now sustainability is incorporated in the daily, it doesn't show up as, what should your board be, why should your board be worried about? Sustainability is obviously one of them. It's incorporated. Maybe it doesn't have that word, but it's definitely incorporated. And now we are into the AI, geopolitics, misinformation. So I think, there are these swings. That's why I agree with Roy that we do not need specialist directors. What we need is directors who have a lot of good judgment to make good decisions with limited information, very complex decisions with limited information in a very uncertain environment.
It's amazing we got this far without mentioning AI. For all the things that we're talking about, what board directors have to worry about, this is a perfect segue into our first audience question too, because they ask, can you speak to AI governance structures and how they might be lacking in proportion to the degree companies are using them? In other words, given that the best boards have perfect information and structures, it sounds like AI governing a corporation might be the optimal solution. How does AI dovetail with a board or even take it over?
Well, first of all, I smiled when the questioner said boards have perfect information. Yeah. I will tell you, boards do not feel like they have perfect information.
Said the best boards.
They feel like they're always catching up because management probably has better and more current information than any board member does on any given moment, except if they've just finished a board meeting or if they're in a board meeting. The governance around AI is still evolving, but I would say that what's starting to settle in is a governance structure that looks something like this: that there is a board level committee or a management executive committee that provides the overall governance policies for AI. Under that, you have a working group within the organization that is seated by a number of executives, both on the tech side of the company, but also the business side of the company, compliance, that day-to-day governs the activities of AI within that organization. And it's important to have the business people in that committee because that's actually where all the action is. That's where the real stuff gets found. And then around that, you have other groups that are given the responsibility of figuring out what is AI like for our customers? What is AI like for our suppliers? What is AI like for us, whether it be in finance or HR or what have you? And so you have these, sort of a satellite of other committees and groups that are really responsible for finding those. And then you have the development of the actual policies and procedures. When will we use AI? When will we not use AI? So for example, right now, one of the biggest conversations that I hear is, will we use AI for things like year-end performance processes? Right? Will we hand that over to the AI to give all, here's the whole cadre of people that I need to evaluate, and can you rank them for me? Because in most situations, you got to go, here's the best people, so they get the bigger money. Some companies have adopted that, but there's a lot who haven't yet, because they're still waiting to see, does this actually work? And they do not want to take the human element out of the HR performance process that happens once a year, and it's pretty important to most companies. So different organizations, I say, are in very different places on this, but that structure that I described I see starting to emerge as what is best in class.
I'll give the legal perspective, I guess. So usage of AI comes with many legal risks that are familiar and intuitive for everyone here in the room, like AI bias and discrimination or privacy leaks and intellectual property. But for our topic of conversation here, it also meshes well, because if you think about the legal oversight duty of boards or when it comes to geopolitical tensions and how companies handle it, so AI could be good in some things, it could be even counterproductive in other things. For example, it could satisfy your duty to install a system that monitors information and reports to you. But on the other hand, it could increase your exposure. It can crowd the agenda even more, because an AI monitoring system is bound to generate many flags, because it's bound to generate many anomalies. And then it will be up to the human discretion of the board. Do we treat these issues? Do we not treat these issues? If we're treating every issue that the AI is flagging, then we're not doing strategic oversight, and we're not doing foresight, then we're not doing all the other things. So that creates challenges, and right now it's not a panacea for the things that we've been discussing here.
Okay, so I totally second what my colleagues have said here, but I would add one thing, which is the governance of OpenAI companies, not OpenAI, the governance of AI companies, right? So in general, I would say that the governance of AI companies is very, very poor if we, go by our 101 corporate governance. OpenAI just became a benefit public corporation and the purpose is the benefit of humanity. This is very wishy-washy. And then all the other 7 magnificent that they do OpenAI, either do AI, they have very bad corporate governance in the sense that they have mostly dual class shares and the founders have most of the ownership. So there is very little oversight from those boards. They're weak boards.
When you say the 7 magnificents, you're talking about other companies, other AI companies.
Yeah, the other AI companies.
Okay.
So that's that's a little bit worrisome that somebody has to regulate the governance of AI, but the companies working on AI tend to have, in my opinion, poor corporate governance.
Ruth, I thought you were going to talk about your AI director story.
Okay, I can also talk about that.
Yeah.
So I've been talking to a few companies because I work a lot with boards. I've been talking to a few companies that now in their boards, they have AIDEN. Who is AIDEN? AE-DEN. So an AI director. So one of the companies, a very large listed company, S&P 500 company, very, very large company, one of those companies, they decided that this AIDEN would be a combination of 3 brains. Mark Zuckerberg, Warren Buffett, and an institutional investor, like from BlackRock or. Okay, so then they have a board meeting and they ask AIDEN, what do you think about this decision? What do you think should be our risk tolerance? What do you think we divesting from X? Or what do you think about this new initiative? And AIDEN gives an opinion, and at the moment, AIDEN is not voting yet. And that's, and we should discuss what are the fiduciary duties, the legal responsibilities, the duty of care that you've studied, the duty of loyalty. But there are many companies that they're already really actively playing with having that AI director as one of the people in the room and making sure that that person is not biased, that it doesn't do group thinking, that the fingers are out, nose in, all these things.
I want to know whose LLM AIDEN's working on from.
Yeah.
Whose model?
That's fascinating. I'm very skeptical. Just if you ask AI to combine Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and write a novel, I'd be kind of afraid to read that. So I'm not sure what AIDEN's doing there, but it's fascinating. We're going to go from AI to Elon Musk. So did his pay package kill corporate governance? And this is just some milestones attached to that $1 trillion payday are impossible, like Tesla cyber taxis would have to replace 2/3 of all taxis. That seems unrealistic. Is this, I don't know, any thoughts on Elon Musk's pay package?
In general, with executive pay package, the most important aspect from a corporate governance perspective is not the level of pay, but the structure of pay. The level of pay is more salient, is more sexy to talk about in the news media. But what matters is what they get their money for. The structure of pay is what determines the incentives of those who make the decisions in the company and whether they are going to prioritize sustained long-term growth or to prioritize and maybe manipulate short-term points in the road. With Elon Musk, just like with Elon Musk, everything is going up to the extreme. So can't imagine that you need $1 trillion to incentivize someone to put in the efforts, but that's a kind of an issue that is not generalizable to others, I guess.
Gotcha, a little bit of a special situation. Yeah.
I'm very much with Roy on this, and if you have the time, you should read the specifics about what the goals are for Musk to earn his $1 trillion, because they're pretty significant, and I would say they're in his lifetime they may be out of reach. But you never know, right? Because
Yeah.
We didn't know about OpenAI a few years back. But I think what's also important here is what's happening behind the scenes. So Ruth said before about the move of Tesla from Delaware to Texas. What really drove that is that the Delaware court found his compensation package to be illegal, in part because of how it was approved. And Tesla said, well, we don't like that. We're going to take our ball and go over to Texas because Texas is going to let the proposal go through as is with the current shareholder. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that are going on around here too that's around governance, not just the package itself, but what the corporation is doing in part to get that package approved and what other implications it has down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think these 12 items that they are part of the compensation package, 12, no? Around, I think they are mostly a signal from the shareholders that, okay, stop focusing on going to the moon and back, stop focusing on AI, focus on cars, like focus on our company. And it's more about that, yeah.
To get $1 trillion, you need the company to go to the moon.
Yeah. Might happen. So just staying on executive comp here, one question is, what is the best executive compensation structure? It's obviously something boards have to do, but national political climates or state climates even can affect this. So it kind of ties into geopolitics here. So the question is, LTIP plans and stock options or salary, how does this relate to the U.S. political climate and the 8% tax increase for the wealthy over capital gains tax? So it's a little bit of a granular question, but anybody want to take that on?
You're looking at me like the compensation.
I'm looking at
compensation consultant.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that companies, companies use and boards, use compensation packages and the structure of them to align the strategy of the firm with the decisions that the CEO will take. However, there are, one important note is that the politics matter a lot in the sense that if you are in Europe, usually these compensation packages are a lot more moderate. There is less inequality between that CEO and the average employees, whereas here in the United States, it can be, a lot more exuberant and, a lot more, I don't know the right word, but there's a lot more inequality, and then we come up with this 3 trillion,
The so-called public outrage constraint. And in Europe, the outrage constraint is very limiting, and in the US, not so much.
Yeah, I think the question said, "What's the best package?" And I don't think there is a best. I think it very much depends on, what the company is about, what is the challenge in front of the CEO, particularly if you're talking about CEO comp as compared to maybe broadly executive comp. What are the values of the company? So you think about Ben & Jerry's, and they were very clear that Ben & Jerry would only make, 6 times the amount of the lowest paid, something relatively modest, right? So more in line with what happens in Europe. And that was a very important part of who they are as an organization. I think, though, most structures that people deem as fair, right? And again, this is a board responsibility. What does a CEO get paid? Is something that combines all the aspects of performance, short-term, medium-term, long-term. Not just sales and profits, but retention of key customers, retention of key employees. Succession planning. Is the CEO planning for her or his succession? And are there enough people inside the company, or is there a plan for when she or he finally does leave, that there are a reasonable amount of people in place in the organization to be considered? Mm-hmm. All of those things are part of a package, whether it's more salary than stock options or RSUs or vice versa. I think really depends on where is the company in its life cycle today, and where does the board want that CEO to get that company to during their tenure of the company going forward.
I would add just one word, which is benchmark.
Yeah.
Okay, if we do stock options and you can compensate someone because the entire industry, some macro factors like a war or oil prices going up, and that CEO is getting like $40 million, $50 million, but it's not like we incentivize them to put in the right strategy. So as long as you benchmark your executive pay to the performance of your peers. If you outperform them, you receive more money. If you underperform them, you receive less money. That's good practices.
Especially because CEOs, have big egos and they care what their peers in the golf course are getting paid.
Yeah. Did a great, just a quick plug for the podcast. We did a really interesting series on executive compensation for anybody who wants to go back and listen to those. Just mindful of this audience here, one question we got is, how do we upskill and train business school students to effectively manage geopolitical risks? Like you have these students, it's been a real privilege to hear smart people think through these questions. What would you recommend to this audience that they should be asking themselves, and what should business schools be doing to prepare students for these questions?
I'm probably less equipped than both Kevin and Ruth to comment on this coming from a law school perspective, but I would just say this goes back to our conversation of boardrooms. Say that the board realizes that they do need to discuss geopolitics. And you're a director and you're coming through marketing. It's not necessarily clear that you would know how to do it properly. It's not necessarily clear that you would know how to anticipate questions that are not there on the PowerPoint deck and process answers and think about future problems. So in a world like today, 2025, where geopolitical tensions are becoming a critical corporate governance component, so just like with AI proficiency, what used to be financial literacy, knowing how to read financial reports, I can't imagine that there will be, in a world like today, a senior corporate decision maker who has zero proficiencies in these issues. So I guess the advice is just take those courses.
Yeah. Ruth, did you want to add?
I mean, I would just say really, keep up, constantly keep up with the news, with outside of the United States and in the United States. So make sure, you read the news and you know what's going on in the world, because when you go to an interview, you need to be completely prepared. When you make a business decision, you need to be completely prepared. And always look at the corporate governance of the companies that you are working for or that you are engaging with.
That's really interesting. Kevin?
I would just say, first of all, being in this room today, thank you. You're doing part of what you need to do. The NACD organization, the national organization, has a summit every October in Washington, D.C. There's about 1,500 public and private company directors that go to that every year, and I was there just a few weeks ago. I went to 4 breakout sessions that were on this topic. So as students, you may think you have a lot to learn. Sitting public company directors of some of the biggest companies in the world were in those rooms doing the same thing. Staying current, understanding what the current issues are, how do we have to think about this, learning from others, asking good questions. This is really all of what you're going to be doing, hopefully for the rest of your lives.
I love that message. We have a minute left, so I just want kind of a 20-second answer from each of you. Next 5-10 years, corporate governance and geopolitics, what do you think we're going to see?
More and faster.
Okay.
I guess resilience, the word that we mentioned here. Boards will be more about resilience, governance, making sure maybe you diversify decision-making center, maybe you pressure test your supply chain. You don't just pressure test within the confines of the walls of your own company. You pressure test your business partners as well. So the focus will be about resilience.
I love that. Yeah.
I think complexity, everything is going to be more intertwined. All the different pillars are going to affect each other, especially in the digital world.
This has been incredibly insightful, Ruth, Roy, Kevin. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise and thanks so much to this audience for contributing to the conversation. It's going to continue down as we come and join the tables and the conversation continues there. But let's please give this excellent panel a big hand.
Thank you so much. This is